Hello, BookTube. Today's photographic theme is Gothic architecture, and that's because last night I finished reading or rereading Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey and also Val McDermid's version of the same story, which was published in 2014. Now, there's a little background to this. This all started because I spotted Val McDermid's story in my local library, and it had this really attention-getting orange cover. I'll just show you here on screen. And I wondered, why would anybody want to rewrite Austen? And I'm not saying that because I think that Austen was perfect. It's more that she's so beloved and she's such an unquestionable part of the English literary canon. It just seemed to me like it would be unwise commercially to do any kind of rewrite. But I knew Val McDermid well because the person who shares this home and who watches the television is a voracious reader of crime and thrillers. So I had long held the opinion that the Gothic elements in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey were not really very Gothic. I don't think she had the knack for dark foreboding, or maybe it's just that she didn't live long enough to perfect the technique, if that's what she had wanted to do. Whereas McDermid did have the ability, and I wondered if could she inject some more dark peril into that story. And that was enough reason for me to go ahead and sign out Val McDermid's book. And so that I could gauge the similarities and differences between the two works, I also bought myself a Kindle version of Austen's Northanger Abbey to read alongside. So let's introduce both books properly. The Val McDermid was a hardback, and so it had 343 pages of text. The Austen Kindle version had no page numbers. I hope that's not something they're going towards, because I really like being able to give page numbers. But it took up 36% of the whole Kindle text, and the paperback version of the same Oxford edition is 432 pages. So if you do the mathematics, I reckon you've got about 155 pages altogether. The first question I asked myself about these books was, what were the respective authors trying to achieve? We'll start with Austen. Northanger Abbey was the first novel that Austen submitted to publishers in 1803, so the first one that she had written in her early 20s. But it never appeared in print while she was alive. It's a very messy story. Crosby and Company were the publishers who accepted the novel. They paid Austen £10 for the manuscript, and then they just sat on it. She wrote them letters using a pseudonym in 1809, complaining, asking them to either do something with the book or let her submit it to another publisher, and there was a lot of back and forth going on. Finally, in 1816, her brother was able to buy back the manuscript, and then inexplicably, Austen didn't do anything with it herself. In fact, in March 1817, she was writing to her cousin, and she mentioned the protagonist of Northanger Abbey, Catherine. She said, quote, "Miss Catherine is put on the shelves for the present, and I do not know that she will ever come out." Now, Jane had lifelong health problems. Anybody who knows Austen's life knows that. Maybe she knew in March 1917 that she did not have very long to live, that there might not have been time to do the revising that she would like to do with Northanger Abbey. But personally, I think it also makes sense to speculate whether Austen would have preferred not to publish it. I say that because critical opinion has not viewed Northanger Abbey as being in the same league with her other 5 novels. And I personally feel the difference when I read Pride and Prejudice or Persuasion, that they don't seem like they're quite the same thing as Northanger Abbey. And I began to understand what E.M. Forster meant. If you've watched aspects of the novel video, you'll know that he talks about the difference between storytelling and plotting. Catherine Morland, in Volume 1, we are getting storytelling. One event after another event, after another event, after another event. There's really no complication. The only subplot is James Morland's sort of undocumented courtship and his tepid engagement to Isabella Thorpe. The second half of the book, the so-called Gothic half, feels so different that even the Jane Austen Society admit that Northanger Abbey is 2 books rather than 1. Now, they believe the 2 are, and I'm quoting here, cleverly and most effectively welded into 1, unquote. But I can't agree. It's a very, very weird smashing together of 2 rather different works. But it is a first novel. And first novels, they're a bit like other first things that you do. And if you don't mind, I'm going to just let you think of your own examples of that, okay? Good. First attempts at anything are never usually the best. So I just wonder whether Austen realized this when she got the manuscript back from the publishers. Did she think maybe it was better not to have it go out and then be compared alongside Pride and Prejudice or Emma? Personally, I believe Crosby & Co. did her a favor, even though, no, they had absolutely no idea that that's what they were achieving. If we compare that with Val McDermid, McDermid had written 32 novels before she was approached by the Borough Press imprint of HarperCollins and asked if she would take part in their 2013 Austen project. I'll leave a link to a short YouTube video, which appears, it's a few weeks before the publication of her version of Northanger Abbey, and she's speaking to the Jane Austen Society. The impression I got was that Val was very happy to take part in the project, but there was no indication that she wanted or that she was permitted to have a free hand in how she wrote her own version of Northanger Abbey. It sounded to me as though she was required to remain faithful to the original story structure throughout. So are the books the same? There is no essential difference in the events, in the order those events are given. And for a while, I was even compiling a like-for-like table of chunks of character dialogue. So it is very, very close. But obviously, it's not 100% the same. Otherwise, what would be the point? Val McDermid set her version of Northanger Abbey in the 21st century. And that meant she had to make some small adjustments in order for those elements of isolation and surprise, which are needed in the original book, to come off, given that your characters now have internet access and smartphones. And I think those adjustments were plausible. McDermid also took her version of Catherine Morland further away from home. She had to. You remember, Austen's protagonist had to travel for a day in a horse and carriage. Now, Bath, by car, is only 90 minutes from where the Morlands live. So what McDermid did was moved Catherine all the way up to Edinburgh, and she also moved Northanger Abbey from Gloucestershire up to the Scottish borders. Now, when I realized that, I thought, this adjusted setting is going to allow for a grimmer, wilder, Bronte-esque, feel to McDermid's book. But I think I got my hopes up too high. Let's look at the weaknesses of Northanger Abbey, regardless of who wrote the book. Let's look at Volume 1 first, which is mainly Catherine's time in Bath. If we use E.M. Forster's concept, you do not need a split brain to handle this book. Forster said if a novel was well plotted, half of your brain was needed just to read the text itself and understand what you were seeing, and then the other half of your brain was needed to remember what you'd already read and to begin to piece together and make sense out of the complications. But there are no complications in Northanger Abbey, none whatsoever. Basically, the situations alternate between Catherine Morland being able to spend time with Henry Tilney, which is what she wants, and having to endure what actually happens to her. In Austen's novel, there's just nothing Gothic about Volume 1, nothing. Now, McDermid attempts to sex it up a bit with copious vampire and Twilight references. Now, don't get me wrong, I watched the Twilight movies, I read the Twilight books, I enjoyed them, not because they were good, but because they had this eerie way of inducing an adolescent state of mind, kind of like a fever, but that's a subject for another video. But in spite of that, I actually found McDermid's vampiric hints, they were a little too much, frankly. They were more than what was necessary for foreshadowing, and they just created more irritation than suspense. Volume 2 of Northanger Abbey. Now that has some plotting, that is to say, the events which happened in Bath or in Edinburgh, depending upon which book you read, they do intrude on Catherine Morland's pleasant visit with the Tilneys at the Abbey. And Austen attempts to give her readers a little Gothic adventure also, but she was young and she did not know how to bring that off. Northanger Abbey, in my opinion, is not a Gothic novel, and it does not function as a parody of the Gothic either. It is an Austen novel that somehow caught a Gothic virus about halfway through, but it only suffered mild symptoms, and then it was able to return to its normal, genteel, drawing room state of health. Okay? The Gothic atmosphere is never convincing in either book. Val McDermid does her best to make the spooky parts spookier, and she is able to improve the suspense somewhat. But it would take a comprehensive rethink of the book, I believe, a fresh approach right from the outset to really put the frighteners on. Speaking personally, that's what I was really hoping that Val McDermid would do. I wanted her to exercise her powers of plotting and suspense and invent a fresh story. Just use enough material, keep enough elements from Austen's novel so that the publishers could say that it was based on Northanger Abbey. Okay, that was a very naive hope on my part, because no sane publisher is going to mess with Austen. Her reputation is such that even Northanger Abbey, which is imperfect and it is in need of an editor's mentoring just like any other first novel would be, it's acquired this canonical sacredness. And you can't reimagine it without causing great offense to Jane Austen fans. And you've got to bear in mind that's commercial suicide, because it must be Austen fans that HarperCollins was hoping to attract. It's interesting, though, that the Borough Press imprint, it meant to reproduce all 6 of Jane Austen's novels, but it only managed 4. And I gather that sales of those rewritten versions were not what they had hoped for. Let's bring some light in and switch the focus to what's good. Northanger Abbey, it may be an imperfect manuscript, but Austen's particular strengths, they still show through. And if Crosby & Co. had taken the trouble back then to read her submitted manuscript carefully, they would have noticed Austen's talents, how she can tease out comedy from these minute social behaviors, and she creates these delicious ironies and contradictions. And if they'd let their wives and daughters and sisters read that book, then they would have been told just how easily Austen makes you love the people that deserve to be loved, despise the people that deserve to be despised, just how much feeling she generates all round and all through her stories. Val McDermid's reimagining of Northanger Abbey, it would be ideal for the reader who's left a little cold by 19th century story structure, or they just get more engaged if they can read about people who are 21st century, who have 21st century habits and speech and proclivities. McDermid told the Jane Austen Society that the greatest challenge was finding the correct voice for the rewrite. She didn't want something too close to Austen, but she didn't want her own normal writing voice. Personally, I felt that Austen's prose in Northanger Abbey, I want to be nice about this because it wasn't bad prose, but it felt less fluent than what I had become accustomed to in Pride and Prejudice or in Persuasion. And so I found McDermid's writing style quite refreshing. But if you're a fan of McDermid's crime fiction, this book will seem completely out of character. You might wonder what made her agree to do it. I would love to know. Did she truly enjoy the constraint of having to retell a less complex story? Was she at all tempted, to take it apart completely and create something better from the pieces? In summary, what would I say? Northanger Abbey is a lighter work than is typical for Val McDermid, and a darker work than is typical for Jane Austen. But they're both romantic, funny, undemanding reads, comforting even at their most gothic moments, which aren't very gothic. Okay, not at all. Choose McDermid's story if you get on better with a modern style. Choose Austen for her own sake, or if you need to impress a die-hard Austen lover. Okay, everyone, that is it for today's Sideline video. Thanks so much for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye-bye.